When you start cybersecurity, you quickly learn that firewalls are a very important part of cybersecurity. And I'm sure that you get intrigued by these really big name, NGFWs, next generation firewalls like the Palo Alto. I don't know if you consider whatever Cisco that, and of course, the topic of whether or not next generation firewall is just a big buzz term. It's a whole topic unto itself, but whatever, you find out about them, you think they're really awesome, you want to get one. So you don't have thousands of dollars to plunk down on one of these next generation firewalls, but there are things that you can invest in that will give you some good experience with firewalls. And you find out about pfSense. pfSense is an open source firewall that you can take and install on any device that meets the minimum hardware requirements, and they're not that big. If you go on Amazon, you'll see all these devices that are tailor-made for the pfSense firewall. They're pfSense firewall appliances, whatever. $200, $300. But what we can do is we can install pfSense on something like a Sophos XG 115 firewall appliance, which is a very decent firewall appliance. And with pfSense, you can do things like, even though it can't pull off the layer 7, application layer packet filtering like the NGFWs can, you can still install Snort on it. You can install Suricata. You can create a VPN. I just think that's really cool. And I think it makes a great cybersecurity project. If you go on eBay, I got mine for $79, and it's not uncommon to see Sophos XG 115 firewalls for that much. Now note, there is this thing called the Sophos XG 115 Revision 2. The Revision 2 has an HDMI port on the back. The one I have just has a VGA port and a port for the console cable. So you got to keep that in mind. Otherwise, you'll get it and it'll be like, whoa, dude, let's install pfSense, and you find out, oh, great, and now I have to order a console cable because I don't have a VGA cord. So be aware of that. If you go this route, make sure you get the right revision so that when you get the firewall, you'll be, ready to go. So here's the procedure we're going to follow. Step 1, we're going to write the pfSense image to a USB drive using Rufus. Step 2, we're going to communicate with the firewall over the console cable and get it ready to install pfSense. And then we're actually going to install pfSense. So number 3, we're going to access pfSense from the console so that we can set it up and then access it from the GUI. And then step 4, from the GUI, we're actually going to configure the firewall so that we can route traffic across it. Now, before we get started, I want to show you what you'll need if you decide to go the Revision 2 route, which is the Sophos XG115 that I happen to get. It's the one that doesn't have an HDMI port on the back. But anyway, what you see here is a picture of the console cable I got, and down below in the comments is a link to that particular console cable. It's tested, it works, does everything you need. Just get that cable, you can plug it up to your computer, and as you'll see, we can connect to the firewall through the COM port. So anyway. All right, so the first thing we want to do is we want to get Rufus. Rufus is the program that we're going to use to write the ISO image to a USB drive. And what we want to do is go here to rufus.ie and go down the page and find the version you need. For me, standard Windows x64. Install Rufus to whatever directory, and then we move on to the next step. So now what we want to get is the pfSense Memstick installer, Memstick Image, whatever it's called. You want to go here to pfSense.org download, and you want to go down here and select AMD 64 as your architecture. The installer is the USB Memstick installer, and you want to select serial as your console. After that, just click download, put it wherever. Next step is to actually write the ISO image to a USB drive. So what we see here is I've got Rufus brought up. I've selected my USB drive. I've already selected the pfSense Memstick installer as my boot device, or as my ISO image. From there, there's nothing else we need to do here. We're just going to go ahead and write the image to the USB drive, and we'll zoom to when it's done. What we see here is Rufus telling us that it's going to be, wiped out. And of course, it makes sure that that's what you want before you say okay. So then Rufus is going to go through its thing where it, actually writes the ISO file to the drive, and we'll continue on. Okay, and it's done. Now we have our pfSense drive ready. Now, before we can install, we've got to get connected to the firewall via that USB cable we got. So first thing we need to do is find out where the COM port is. What we can do is go to Device Manager, and Device Manager is going to list everything, including ports, COM, and LPT. That's what we want right there. You should, if you got the same cable, you should see that in your list. Here we can see that it's COM6, so we know that's the COM port we're going to need to use. Next thing we're going to need are some settings that we're going to put into a program called Putty, which will allow us to connect to the firewall. This page right here, link will be in the description. This is the Sophos support page, which tells you what settings to use. Now, what's important here is that we want this to be according to this guide, but this we want to change. We want to use 115,200. Because if you use this when you're trying to install pfSense, it'll look like gibberish, garbled gibberish. So make sure that you change this to 115,200. That's important. Something else that you need to be aware of is that the Sophos firewall has BIOS settings that you're going to need to change to install pfSense. Here's the thing. With respect to this video, I've already installed pfSense on mine. Did a long time ago. I remember specifically, but by the way, this is a page, links can be in the description, about settings that you may have to change in the BIOS. I know for a fact that I had to do this, disable port 6040 emulation. I don't remember having to do any of this. However, it'd be handy to have this link as a troubleshooting guide if you run into issues with the BIOS. If you're using this guide as a method, or if you're using my method to get pfSense on a Sophos firewall, it should work because everything I did worked for me. But just keep these things in mind. Maybe Google pfSense Sophos BIOS, XG115, things like that, in case you run into trouble. But I was able to get mine installed without a hitch. Everything I found, I remember was here. So whether or not I did all this, I can't remember, but if I did, it came from this. So keep this link handy and you should do okay. So the next step is to download Putty, and putty.org is where you would normally go, but putty.org was down at the time. I couldn't reach it. So I went to puttygen.com. And this is a recent release of Putty. And you'll just go down here, pick the installer you want. 64-bit, x86, Install Putty, and we're ready to go. All right, so we've got Putty installed. We got our USB stick ready. We're ready to install this thing. What we need to do now is make sure the settings are correct for Putty. So in Putty, what we need to make sure of is here we've got our COM port, the one that we found earlier. Now, earlier I mentioned we want to change 38,400 to 115,200. Let me correct that. When you initially connect and you change your BIOS settings, you want it to be 38,400. When you actually install pfSense, like when you reboot it, that's when you want it to be 115,000. So just take note of that. When we first boot into it and set those BIOS settings, we're going to make sure that it's 38,400. Serial, make sure that's set, and then just a few other settings. Like right here, Data bits needs to be 1, stop bits needs to be 1, parity and flow control both need to be cut off according to that document we looked at earlier. So now that we've got our settings, we're ready to connect to the firewall. So let's do that. All right, here we go. We're going to turn the firewall on, and I'm going to quickly press the delete key, or is it F2? Anyway, we want to be ready to go into the BIOS as soon as it gets. Here we go. Okay, we're in the BIOS. And because my BIOS is already set up, I'm just going to go through where you need to go to do the stuff in the document. Now, again, some of those things I don't remember doing, but I know I had to do this right here. You go to Advanced, USB configuration, and you want to make sure that's disabled. Okay, so then the next thing we need to do is make it so that we boot from the pfSense Memstick. All right, and as you can see here, my flash drive has been selected as the boot device. And then what we want to do is save and exit, save changes and reset. And what I'm going to do is make sure the firewall turns off after I do this, because we're going to have to load it back up in a different baud rate. All right, now let's turn the firewall off. All right, so the next thing we want to do is go back to Putty, and here's where you want to set it to 115,200. Otherwise, you're going to get gibberish when it boots from the Memstick. All right, so let's turn the firewall back on. And we should see in a second here the pfSense loading screen. And we'll just let that load. It's going to go through a long boot sequence. So it's going to automatically boot. And then what we're going to do is continue when it gets to the screen where we can actually start setting this thing up. Okay, so what we do here is we just go with VT100. And we're going to accept that, install pfSense. We're going to do guided root on ZFS. And we'll just use this same name because I've had it in there before, so it recognizes it, but it doesn't matter if you just leave it the same. All right, so we want to proceed with the installation. Go with Stripe. And then you want to press spacebar here to select that disk, which is just a hard disk in the firewall. And we want to say yes to that. So now pfSense is going to go through its thing where it extracts the files, all that good stuff. And we'll pick up when we get back to where we can continue installing, configuring this thing. One thing I forgot to mention in that last video, remove the USB stick. Otherwise, it's going to reboot into it. Or power it down, whatever. Anyway, now we're going to see it boot into its first boot, and what we'll do is we'll pick up from where it actually prompts us to configure it and everything. All right, and what you see here is our configuration screen. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and get this thing a connection to the internet. Or actually, the first thing we want to do is assign interfaces. Now, on the back of the Sophos firewall, you've got LAN, then WAN, then optional. So IGBO is actually going to be the LAN interface, and IGB1 is going to be the WAN interface. You've got 0, 1, and then 2. So that's what we want to do here. We want to go ahead and assign interfaces. So let's set this up. No VLANs. And the WAN interface, of course, is going to be IGB1. And the LAN interface is going to be IGB0. And then optional, we got nothing there. So yep, that's how we have our interfaces set up. All right. So what we want to do now, I'm going to go ahead and set it up so that All right, what I'm going to do now is just go ahead and kind of set up the local area network the way I want it, and then we can connect to it via the web configurator and carry on with configuration. So let's go ahead and set interface's IP address. Let's go ahead and set up the LAN IP address. We want to configure LAN. Nope. So my network is going to be set up as 192.168.200, and it's going to be 1. And the subnet mask is going to be 255.255. Da, 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 da. And we'll just we have no DHCP6. And yes, we want to enable a DHCP server. And the way I set it up is just with the first 100 for dynamically assigned addresses, and the rest are what I use for static. Anyway, 200.2 is going to be the start address, and then 192.168.200.100 is going to be the ending address. And yes, just use HTTP. Okay, so now we can connect to the web configurator and carry on with configuration that way. Okay, so now we're ready to actually log in to the firewall and make the magic happen. So here we go. Now this is a log. I've used this before, so it's got that previous password, remember, but the default creds for the pfSense firewall are admin and pfSense. And here we are. We're at the front page. So let's get this thing set up. Okay, so we just want to go on over to next. We'll hit next here. Just for the purposes of video, keep the host name as pfSense, domain is home.arpa, leave all this blank. Next, I'm going to keep this time server blank, default for now. And here we're going to configure WAN to be DHCP, of course, and everything else can remain blank. And the LAN IP address is going to stay the same. We'll just keep this basic. Just keep it basic, not literally, but, Anyway, set that as a basic password. And then we reload, and we will be ready to go. Okay, anyway, we've got pfSense installed, and as you can see here, we've got all this information, and it tells us primarily that we've got an upstream link and we've got a local area network link. Okay, so once you get everything set up right, and you can see that you've got a WAN address, which means your ISP is past unit address, and you got your LAN address here, the next thing to do is reboot this thing. Okay, anyway, let's go ahead and test this out. Just show that we can go to google.com. There we go. Right. And if we just wanted to search for something, pfSense. There we got it. pfSense. And that's pretty much it. So as you can see here, we have taken a Sophos XG 115 firewall, and we have installed pfSense on it. And from here, you can do all sorts of cool stuff. You can install Suricata, Snort. You can experiment with IDSs and IPSs. And you can set up a VPN, get all sorts of cool hands-on experiences, or even just write old-fashioned, firewall rules. Because it's a really cool piece of equipment. I mean, it's a really cool firewall. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So see you, pals.